Camilla, I'd like to talk about Queen Camilla and the role she's played from sort of lover, mistress to now queen, and the influence she's had on Charles, the shaping of him. How is he different to, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago?
Buckingham Palace has always been good at one thing: making chaos look like tradition. The smiles are steady, the schedules never slip, the photos look calm. But behind that calm is the most controversial globe in modern royal history, and it's centered on one person. Because whether you love her, hate her, or you're just tired of hearing her name, Queen Camilla didn't simply marry into the monarchy. She outlasted it. She survived the one storyline the palace usually can't survive, being cast as the other woman, and ended up wearing a crown anyway. And that raises a bigger question people keep dodging. What exactly has she done to King Charles? Not in a magical fairy tale way. In a real way. In a look at him now versus 10, 20, 30 years ago kind of way. Because the version of Charles you see today didn't happen by accident. And it definitely didn't happen without a cost. And it starts way earlier than most people think. Back in the early 1970s, Charles wasn't the king-in-waiting we picture now. He was younger, restless, and already trapped inside a role he didn't choose. Then he meets Camilla, confident, not impressed by titles, and comfortable enough to tease him like he's just a guy. Their early connection is one of those royal what-if moments people still obsess over, because it's always sounded like the most normal thing in his life. ABC News +1, but normal is exactly what the royal machine doesn't allow. The future monarch has requirements, expectations, a whole invisible checklist. And Camilla, older, with a social life and relationships that didn't fit the palace's preferred image. Wasn't the clean slate the system wanted? So duty steps in. Camilla marries Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973. Charles eventually marries Diana in 1981. Wikipedia +1, and that's where the public story begins. But it's not where the private story ends, because while the world watched a royal wedding like it was a blockbuster premiere, the real foundation was shaky. People who followed the royals closely have long argued that Charles never emotionally replaced Camilla. And when Charles and Diana's marriage started cracking, the cracks didn't stay private for long. You know what happened next? Because it became one of the most replayed royal storylines ever. The War of the Wales, the breakdown, the competing narratives, and the moment Princess Diana said the line that basically tattooed itself onto history, there were 3 people in the marriage. And guess who the public decided to aim at? Camilla didn't just become unpopular. She became a symbol, the face of betrayal. The woman blamed for ruining the fairy tale, and for years, it wasn't even close. She was treated like the villain of the entire monarchy's modern era. Vanity Fair +1, but the royal story wasn't done humiliating them yet, because in 1993, something leaked that took the mess from rumor to this is real. A private phone call between Charles and Camilla recorded illegally, then splashed into the press, blew up into what became known as Tampongate or Camillagate. And it didn't just embarrass them. It basically confirmed what people suspected and turned them into a punchline overnight. Time +2 Wikipedia, +2 for Charles, it was brutal. It made him look reckless, immature, out of touch. For Camilla, it made her the target all over again, this time with a scandal that couldn't be brushed off as gossip. And here's the part people forget. When your reputation gets shredded that publicly, you either disappear, or you learn how power really works. Because from that point on, their relationship wasn't just romantic. It was strategic. Survival became the mission. Years pass. Diana's tragic death in 1997 changes everything, including the emotional temperature of the country. And suddenly, the palace is walking on a minefield. Every move matters. Every appearance can spark backlash. And for Charles, the question becomes, how do you bring Camilla into the light without setting the whole institution on fire? It took years, and the approach wasn't loud. It wasn't win them over in one speech. It was slow exposure, small steps, carefully managed public sightings, and a very deliberate message. Camilla isn't trying to be anyone else. She's not competing. She's just there. By 2005, they marry. Not with a fireworks and carriage fantasy, but with a more restrained, realistic tone, because by then, everyone understood this wasn't a fairy tale. It was a long fight for legitimacy. ABC News. And this is where Camilla's influence becomes easier to see, because once she's officially in, Charles starts looking different. Not instantly, but noticeably. If you look back 30 years, Charles in the 1990s often came off stiff and defensive, like a man trapped inside his own reputation. Even when he tried to explain himself, it sometimes made things worse. Because the public didn't want explanations, they wanted a villain, a hero, and a clean storyline. Time plus one then looked 20 years back, in the mid-2000s and early 2010s. That's when you start seeing him appear steadier in public, less brittle, still serious, still intense, but not constantly on the verge of looking offended by the world. And then in the last 10 years, something shifts again. He looks lighter, not carefree, but less like he's performing someone else's script. Even some longtime observers have described him as more relaxed, more himself, especially with Camilla beside him. Vanity Fair plus one. That doesn't mean she changed his personality like flipping a switch. It means she might have done something more valuable inside royal life. She gave him a pressure valve, because the monarchy is basically pressure. You can't speak your mind fully. You can't vent publicly. You can't admit uncertainty without it being treated like weakness. So if you're a man like Charles, emotional, sensitive to criticism, and famously intense about his causes, you need someone who can bring you back down to earth. That's the role multiple profiles and Palace Insider style reports have credited Camilla with: calming him, grounding him, and pushing him to keep moving rather than spiraling. People.com plus one. But here's the twist. The very thing that makes Camilla useful is also the thing that makes her controversial, because Camilla isn't just a supportive wife, she's part of the most complicated PR recovery mission the monarchy has ever run. That brings us to the modern drama. People still can't agree on how much of this comeback was genuine and how much was engineered. In recent years, the argument got louder because Prince Harry poured fuel on it. In his book and interviews, he criticized Camilla's relationship with the British press, describing her as dangerous and claiming she traded access or stories to improve her image, suggesting that sometimes other family members paid the price. Those are allegations, not proven facts, and the palace hasn't publicly answered them. But the claims alone matter, because they hit the monarchy's most sensitive nerve. The press deals nobody admits. Time plus 2 AP, News plus 2, and it puts Camilla in a weird position. On one hand, you have a long documented history of the royal family being hunted by tabloids, with private moments turned into public entertainments, sometimes through leaks, sometimes through invasions, sometimes through insider cooperation. Time plus one, on the other hand, Harry's narrative paints Camilla as a willing player in that system when it benefited her reputation. And plenty of royal watchers push back, saying the portrayal is one-sided, shaped by family conflict, and contradicted by other accounts. News.com.au plus one. So what's the truth? We can't know the full truth from the outside. What we can see is the effect. Camilla's image improved dramatically over time, and Charles' public life stabilized once she became the constant presence. And the timing of that matters, because when Charles finally becomes king in 2022, he inherits a monarchy that's already battling modern skepticism. Debates in parts of the Commonwealth about becoming republics don't just come from nowhere. Scandals and instability accelerate them. And every new controversy becomes an argument for people who want to cut ties. People.com. That means Charles doesn't just need love. He needs steadiness. He needs a partner who can do the boring, unglamorous job: show up, shake hands, keep calm, and never turn the spotlight into a meltdown. And during the past couple of years, especially with health news affecting the royal family, Camilla's public role has looked more like a stabilizer than an accessory. Reports around 2024 noted she stepped up visibly while Charles underwent treatment and reduced some public-facing duties. People.com. So when you ask, how has she shaped him? The answer might be less romantic than people expect. Camilla's influence seems to show up in three places. First, his emotional presentation. Charles still has his intensity, but he appears less isolated in it. There's more ease, more humor. Vanity Fair plus 1 second, his image management. Whether you believe the PR arguments or not, the reality is that Charles went from permanent controversy in the 90s to functional monarch today. That shift required more than time passing. It required the public being willing to move on, and Camilla being positioned in a way that made the country less angry over time. Vanity Fair plus 1/3 his approach to the job. As Prince of Wales, Charles was known for outspoken interests and advocacies, sometimes so outspoken it sparked debate about royal neutrality. As king, he's expected to be more restrained, and even profiles have noted a transition away from anything considered too political. That kind of shift is hard for someone who has spent decades building a personal mission, and the person closest to him, especially someone described as a calming counterbalance, matters more than ever. Vanity Fair, but that brings us to the uncomfortable part. Maybe it's both, because if you strip away the romance and the headlines, what you're left with is something colder but more real. Camilla is the person who stayed when Charles' image was at its lowest. She's the person who stood next to him through the slow rebuild. And now, as king, she's the person who helps him look steady sometimes, simply by acting like everything is normal, even when it isn't. And if that's true, then the final twist is this. Camilla didn't just change Charles from then to now. She changed what the public believes is possible in the monarchy. If the most disliked woman in Britain could become queen, then what else can be rewritten? What else can be rehabilitated? And what does that say about how much of royal life is tradition, and how much is just narrative? Because the crown looks permanent, but the story around it, that's always been negotiable. So, here's the question I'll leave you with. When you watch Charles today more controlled, more careful, and strangely more at ease, are you seeing a king who finally became himself, or a king who learned, with Camilla's help, how to survive the cameras? Either way, the most powerful influence in his reign might not be a politician, a crisis, or even public opinion. It might be the one person the palace tried to keep out of the story, who ended up rewriting the ending, if you want. I can also rewrite this into an even faster short sentence, pacing version, while keeping the same facts and adding more cliffhanger-style transitions. And the wild part is, the public only sees the polished version. They don't see the private dynamic that insiders have hinted at. For years, Charles has always been a man who talks things through, who can spiral into frustration when he feels boxed in. Camilla, by contrast, has a reputation for being blunt, practical, and emotionally steady. Not the kind of person who doesn't feed the panic. The kind of person who looks at a royal crisis and says, "Fine, what's the plan?" And that difference matters, because kingship isn't just ceremonies. It's constant pressure, with zero room to break. But that stability didn't come free. It came with trade-offs that still irritate people today. Because for a lot of the public, Camilla is never just Camilla. She's always linked to a chapter they still consider unfinished. Diana isn't just a memory in this story, she's a permanent comparison. And comparisons are dangerous, because they make every move feel like a competition, even when nobody says it out loud. That's why Camilla's approach has always been cautious. She rarely She doesn't chase the spotlight like a celebrity. She leans into safe causes, low-drama appearances, and consistency. Over time, that strategy didn't make everyone love her. But it did something more important. It made people stop feeling like they had to argue about her every single day. And that silence, that's basically the monarchy's oxygen. But here's where things get even more interesting. Once Charles became king, Camilla's influence stopped being a relationship story and started looking like a reign story. Because the moment he took the crown, Charles had to become smaller, in one way less opinionated, less expressive, less Prince of Wales writing letters and pushing ideas. As king, every word carries constitutional weight. Every gesture becomes a headline. So the man who spent decades building a personal identity suddenly had to mute himself. That's not easy for anyone. And it's even harder for someone who waited his entire life to finally be in charge, only to discover the job is mostly restraint. So when you watch him now and think, he seems different, you're not wrong. The job changed him. But the bigger question is, did Camilla soften that change? Or accelerate it? Because there are two ways to interpret what happened to Charles over the last 10 to 20 years. One interpretation is romantic. Camilla gave him the one thing he never had: peace. A partner who wasn't trying to be the nation's fantasy, but was willing to be his reality. A safe space behind the scenes. And you can see hints of that in how he acts around her. Especially compared to the tense, defensive energy he had in the 90s. But the other interpretation is colder. Camilla didn't just give him peace. She gave him a system, a controlled environment, a protective bubble, a routine, less chaos, less emotional unpredictability. And when you're trying to survive the world's loudest microscope, routine becomes power. And that's why the press war conversation never goes away. Because even today, people still believe there are invisible deals behind the scenes, access for protection, silence for favorable framing, a quiet trade that keeps the machine running. And when Prince Harry's claims hit the public, they didn't just attack Camilla personally, they attacked the idea that she earned her public comeback fairly. Now, to be clear, those are allegations and interpretations. Outsiders can't prove private arrangements, and royal coverage is filled with conflicting accounts. But the reason it sticks is simple. It sounds believable to people who've watched the palace manage narratives for decades, and if that's true even, partially, then Camilla's greatest influence on Charles might not be emotional at all. It might be strategic, because she's the one person in his life who's survived every era of scandal: the 70s secrecy, the 80s image building, the 90s explosions, the 2000s rehab, the 2010s stabilization, and now the 2020s, where the monarchy is fighting relevance. You don't survive all that by being passive. You survive by understanding the rules better than anyone else. And the rules are brutal. Never look desperate, never look divided, and never give the public a clear villain inside the institution, if you can help it. Which is why Camilla's public behavior is almost engineered to be uninteresting. That sounds like an insult, but it's not. In monarchy terms, being boring is the highest form of control. A boring royal doesn't become a headline. A boring royal doesn't create a scandal cycle. A boring royal lets the institution breathe. So if Camilla has shaped Charles, she may have shaped him toward one goal: survival through stability. But then you hit the final layer of this story. And it's the layer people avoid because it feels uncomfortable to admit. Charles didn't just fight to marry Camilla. He also bet the monarchy's emotional credibility on it, because when Charles finally married her, the palace wasn't just legalizing a relationship. It was rewriting the moral lesson. It was saying, yes, there was pain. Yes, there was chaos. But this is where the story lands. That's a massive gamble. And once you gamble like that, you can't easily walk it back. Without looking like the institution has no core, which is why Camilla's role now is bigger than her title. She's not just the king's wife, she's the proof that the monarchy can survive its own mess. And that's exactly why she's still such a magnet for suspicion, because every time the monarchy looks stable, people ask, is it real or is it managed? Every time Charles looks calm, people ask, is he happier or just better coached? Every time Camilla smiles beside him, people ask, is that love or strategy? And maybe the honest answer is, it's both. Because royal life forces both. You don't get to be just in love, not at that level. Love becomes policy. Marriage becomes optics. Privacy becomes a security issue. So when you ask how Charles is different now compared to 10, 20, 30 years ago, here's the cleanest way to put it. 30 years ago, Charles looked like a man fighting the public. 20 years ago, he looked like a man trying to rebuild. 10 years ago, he looked like a man learning how to live with his own story. He looks like a king who finally understands the job is less about being admired and more about being endured. And Camilla, she's the person who taught him how to be endured, not by winning everyone over overnight, but by surviving long enough that the public gets tired of being angry. That's influence, that's shaping, that's power, and it leads to the real cliffhanger. What happens next? Because the monarchy is entering a new era where the public doesn't automatically respect tradition. People want transparency. They want authenticity. They want proof. And the royal family isn't built for that. It's built for distance, mystery, and controlled access. So if the future demands openness, and the monarchy depends on secrecy, something has to give. And when something gives, it's usually not the crown, it's the people around it, which makes Camilla's position strangely risky. Not because she's weak. Central figures absorb the blame when the system shakes. So here's the question viewers don't expect, but they can't stop thinking about once they hear it. If Charles' reign hits a serious storm, will Camilla be his greatest shield? Or will she become the easiest person for the institution to push forward as the sacrifice? Because royal history has a pattern. When survival is on the line, emotion comes second, and the crown always chooses itself.